Good morning, everybody, and thanks for this opportunity for letting me present here before you. The budget has always been a very important document for citizens around the world, and it's especially important for the poor. They are the ones who get affected by decisions made through the government's budget. And that's why we are interested in government budgets. And although government budgets and transparency in budgets have always been important, it's particularly critical now that we begin to focus on budget transparency issues. And this is because of a number of discussions that are currently taking place internationally. For example, climate change financing discussions have spoken about the need for fund transfers from rich countries to poor countries to help them in their transition to low carbon economies. Discussions around the Millennium Development Goals and the achievement of these goals have spoken about the need for greater investments from both donors and governments on programs that are meant to support the achievement of MDG targets. The International Aid Transparency Initiative is calling for transparency in aid flows from donor countries to recipients. The Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative is calling for transparency in flows from revenues raised from exploitation of natural resources. So there's a lot of discussion that's happening about inflows, money that goes into government treasuries. But what happens once that money gets to these treasuries? That's why we focus on budget transparency and on budgets generally. Recognizing the central importance of budgets to the lives of the people, of citizens, the International Budget Partnership designed the Open Budget Survey and published it for the first time in 2006. The survey is the only independent and comparative measure of budget transparency around the world. It assesses whether central governments, national governments, produce and disseminate to the public 8 key and basic budget documents during the course of the year. And the criteria for our assessments is drawn from international good practices, including the IMF's Code on Fiscal Transparency, the OECD's Best Practice Guidelines on Budget Transparency, and the International Organization of Supreme Audit Institutions, INTOSAI's Lima Declaration of Independence of Supreme Audit Institutions. And we've added some guidelines drawing from our own experience of working with civil society organizations. So some of their concerns, especially around accessibility of budget documents, is also captured in the Open Budget Questionnaire. And the kinds of documents that are assessed in this questionnaire, in the survey, are the budget plans, enacted budget, execution reports, as well as audit reports. The survey also assesses the extent of effective oversight provided by legislatures and supreme audit institutions, and opportunities for the public to engage in budget decision making. The survey questionnaire has 123 questions that are multiple choice questions, each of which is quantified. The average score received by 92 of these questions that deals specifically with the public availability, timeliness, and comprehensiveness of information in the 8 key budget reports are used to construct the Open Budget Index, which provides an overall score as well as a rank to each of the countries included in the index. The remaining questions are used to create 2 separate indicators on the strength of supreme audit institutions and legislatures in their budget oversight functions. The survey is managed by the IBP, but conducted in each of the 94 countries that are part of the 2010 survey by independent budget experts drawn from civil society organizations and academia. The survey results are then sent to 2 anonymous and independent peer reviewers. So 2 other experts in each country then review the draft results. We've also sent the completed questionnaires to governments to provide comments on the results. And 45 of the 94 governments provided us with comments on the draft results, and their comments, along with the comments provided by the peer reviewers, are available in the published versions of the questionnaires that we've made available on our website. So you can see the whole discussion between the IPP's researchers, the 2 peer reviewers, the government, and then the final decision made on a particular answer based on the evidence provided by us. The survey is not just a research instrument, although we have invested 25,000 person hours of time in this during the last 18 months. It's also an advocacy tool. Survey results provide us with an opportunity to begin a discussion, a dialogue with governments on what they can do to improve transparency. For example, last year after we released the 2008 results, the government of Brazil sent an official to our office to have a discussion on how Brazil could further improve its score on the Open Budget Index. And as a result of these discussions, just last month, Brazil has for the first time ever published a citizens' budget report, which is a simplified summary of the tens of thousands of pages of technical data that the government has traditionally been publishing. We've also had discussions directly between governments and our partners, between governments and donors and us. So there's a comprehensive discussion that takes place after the survey results are released to see what opportunities there might be in a few countries to make improvements in budget transparency. The survey is also is an opportunity for us to work with civil society organizations and educate them and build their own capacity to engage in budget transparency issues. So there's a very intensive technical assistance component that's involved in the whole research process. And we're working with a team of 300 researchers around the world on this survey. There are 3 key findings from the 2010 survey that I'd like to share with you. The first is that the overall state of budget transparency around the world is pretty poor. I'm sorry, there's problems with this mic. The overall state of budget transparency around the world is very poor. The average score received by the 94 countries that we assessed is 42 out of 100, which, as you can imagine, is not a very good score. In many schools, that would be what you call a failing grade. Of the 94 countries that we've assessed, 74 countries provide inadequate data to enable that would prevent their citizens from getting a comprehensive picture on how governments are raising monies and how they are spending these monies. Gaps in budget transparency exist because certain budget reports, such as the pre-budget statement and the mid-year review, are typically not even produced by governments. Gaps in budget transparency also exist because some budget reports that are published do not contain comprehensive information in them. And this is really a problem during budget execution. So year-end reports and audit reports typically lack comprehensive information. And some kinds of information that are of critical interest to citizens is often missing, especially around anti-poverty programs, and information that would enable people to get a comprehensive picture of the fiscal situation in the country, off-budget activities, contingent liabilities, quasi-fiscal activities. This information is also often missing. Countries performing poorly on budget transparency typically share certain characteristics. These are countries that are located...
Sorry, we're just seeing how slight problems on the sound. Is it probably just worth...
Maybe just going without the mic.
That's what I feel.
I think this one.
Countries performing poorly on budget transparency typically share certain characteristics. Okay. They are located in Africa and the Middle East, low-income countries, often heavily dependent on aid, or heavily dependent on revenues from the sale of extractives. However, what we've also found through our survey, and this is a very important finding, that irrespective of a characteristic that a country has, it does not predetermine its budget transparency standards or practices. So you've got countries like India and Sri Lanka and Ukraine, relatively low-income countries that do relatively well on budget transparency. Colombia and Mexico, heavily dependent on revenues from oil and gas, do relatively well on budget transparency. Uganda and Papua New Guinea, heavily dependent on aid, and do relatively well on budget transparency. South Africa and Botswana, located in Africa, with South Africa coming #1 on the survey, doing well on transparency. Jordan and Egypt in the Middle East, doing relatively well on transparency. So you've got these countries that you can see are performing relatively well on transparency. With several of these, they've not achieved best practices or even good practice criteria, but at least they're not scoring 0 to 40 on the Open Budget Index, which is the lowest that you could get. So it gives us hope. The second key finding is a positive one. We've conducted this survey over the last 6 years on a biennial basis, so this is the third time that we've published the Open Budget Survey results. The average score for the 40 countries for which we have comparable data has gone up by an impressive 20%. Again, these countries have not necessarily achieved best practice or good practices as yet, but from a very low base, they have certainly made progress. And that for us is very encouraging. And what this change has happened because in some countries, governments have begun to publish documents for the first time. They've begun to produce and publish these documents for the first time. In other countries, you've got governments that have increased the comprehensiveness in the contents of published budget reports. So now citizens in these countries have more information on both the revenues and the expenditure side. There have been some countries that have shown impressive improvements that could be considered as surprising cases. So we've seen improvements in Mongolia, in Liberia, in Angola, in Yemen, and in Afghanistan. Again, they've not achieved best practice criteria as yet. They're not yet on the middle or even on the, well, certainly not in the top of our index, but they are no longer at the bottom of the index. So transparency is possible. Now the survey itself does not assess why countries perform poorly or well on budget transparency. That's not what we are assessing. But because this is an issue of interest to people, we did commission some separate research to try and identify what's happening in some of these countries. In fact, that would be a discussion that we'd love to have with you all, especially those of you who have worked on public finance management issues in some countries, to try and figure out what's happening out there that's causing all these changes and some positive news that is coming out there. And so the three reasons that we've found, preliminary reasons on why transparency improvements are happening. One is because in some countries this has happened as a result of the election of a new government or the appointment of an official in a key position, such as the head of the Ministry of Finance or the head of the Supreme Audit Institutions. Reform-minded people or new administrations are pushing the boundaries on transparency and making more information available. And we've got specific country examples in our report that you can refer to. The second reason is due to internal pressures, both from the formal institutions of government, legislatures and auditors that are pushing the boundaries, as well as from local civil society organizations that are also demanding greater transparency from their governments. And the third reason is due to external pressures, both from donors and from international initiatives like ours, the Open Budget Initiative. The third key finding is that lack of transparency is compounded by the existence of weak and ineffective oversight institutions. The Open Budget Index does not measure include the scores for countries' performance on oversight. That, as I mentioned earlier, is separately assessed. But what we found is that there's a very strong correlation between performance on transparency and performance on accountability. And countries performing poorly on transparency are also ones that have weak legislatures and supreme audit institutions. The typical problems faced by legislatures is that they do not often have adequate powers to amend the budget. They do not often have adequate time to review budgets. In the majority of countries, legislatures have less than 3 months, and in several countries, less than 6 weeks to go through tens of thousands of pages of data and numbers before enacting those budgets into law. Legislatures are also frequently undermined during the budget implementation phase, with the executive arbitrarily shifting funds between administrative units and not consulting with the legislature before these changes are being made. Supreme audit institutions suffer from a lack of adequate independence from the executive. It's hard to hold your boss to account and write a negative report about your boss if your job is on the line. And when the head of the Supreme Audit institutions can be fired by the executive without recourse or without permission from the legislature, there are weaknesses in the system. Supreme Audit institutions also frequently do not have adequate resources to be able to comprehensively exercise their mandate. They're short-staffed, are unable to go across the country to be able to undertake their audits. However, it's possible to make improvements. And this is where I'll pass on to Warren to take us through some of the recommendations from the survey.
Thanks, Vivek. I'm going to, as Vivek warned you, just talk briefly to some of the recommendations from the report. And we're going to focus on 4 of the recommendations. 2 short-term, what can be done now, and 2 longer-term, more ambitious recommendations. So looking at the short-term, first recommendation is that countries should publish all of the budget documents they already produce for donors or internal purposes. In other words, governments, most governments on the survey, and particularly those in the bottom 40 governments, can improve budget transparency immediately and at very low cost. To have a look at this, if you look at the next slide, what the slide shows is that the difference between the top performing countries, the 8 in the top category, and the 22 bottom scoring countries is not really a question of how much information they produce. If you look at the bottom category, or the bottom part of the slide, the 22 countries at the bottom of the index already produce 73% of the 8 documents that are required by good practices. Not that much less than the top 8 countries that produce 93% of those documents. The big difference is in the top part of the slide. The 22 countries at the bottom of the index only publish 30% of the information that they produce, whereas the countries at the top of the index publish 93% of that data. What you can do with the survey, and this is on the next slide, is one can look for each country at each of the documents, each of the 8 documents where we assess them. And taking this on an aggregate basis, you can see that for most of these documents, countries have the ability to almost double the amount of budget transparency have the opportunity to almost double budget transparency by publishing the amount of a number of the documents that they already produce. So to take, for example, let me just look at my slides here, the executive's budget proposal. 72 of the 94 countries produce it and publish it. 22 countries produce the document but don't publish it. Now, if the executive's budget proposal is the core part, the first indication that citizens have about what governments want to do with public funds, this is a critical gap that we need to fill. If you look then at the audit reports, for example, 61 countries produce and publish it, 24 countries produce it but don't publish it, 9 countries don't produce it. So the overall point of the slide, or the set of slides, is simply to make the point that we can expand budget transparency dramatically, immediately, and at low cost if we can get these governments to simply push the button to put the data that they're already producing online. Now, this is not to say that in many countries there isn't a great need for extended and deep technical assistance to help them produce the documents that they don't produce. And that's obviously what's happening in the blue part of each of those slides. So that's the first recommendation. The second short-term recommendation is that legislatures and supreme audit institutions could do much more to engage the public in a dialogue on budget processes by expanding or using their existing powers and resources to a much greater degree. The survey shows that of the 94 countries, 68 legislatures do not hold public hearings that provide the public with an opportunity to give evidence on the budgets of individual ministries. Most parliaments around the world, legislatures, have the capacity to hold public hearings and to ask citizens to give evidence. They have a constitutional basis, parliamentary or standing orders to do that. Very few of these parliaments actually push these powers to the maximum. 35 countries, for example, in 35 countries, for example, all of the budget deliberations are completely closed. So what we're calling for here is for parliaments to play their role in this process, to stretch their powers a little bit further, to use the existing capacity they have to bring in citizens. And similarly, you can make a point about the outreach from Supreme Audit institutions. INTERSCI, the International Organization of Supreme Audit Institutions, has recently amended their Good Practices Guide to argue that Supreme Audit institutions should reach out to citizens. Very few Supreme Audit institutions around the world are doing this, and they could do so within their existing capacity. In fact, if they were to do so, it might expand their existing capacity. SAIs, for example, could open a window to ask citizens to suggest where audits could be conducted. They could help citizens to conduct joint or parallel audits. And they could, at the very least, publish audits on time and in an accessible form. 49 countries do not publish audit reports. Of the 94, do not publish audit reports on time in a way that citizens can engage in the process. So those are two short-term recommendations. And I'm going to talk briefly now to two medium-term or slightly more ambitious recommendations. The first one focuses on the need for clarified global norms on budget transparency and accountability. The reason why we're calling from this is really a push that's come from our partners around the world. And the argument they're making is that if there was a clarified and codified norm around budget transparency, or a set of norms around budget transparency, it would give them greater leverage with their governments to ask for specific pieces of information. The first challenge they face, and often legislatures as well, is a government that says, well, where does this demand come from? What countries possibly could do this? Secondly, we think that a norm or set of norms on budget transparency could help aid effectiveness by clarifying the demands of donors and by setting clear country targets on budget transparency. It would also help during the process of developing such a set of norms to mobilize a much broader constituency for budget transparency than we currently find in international development. Where are we? We think that most international institutions already agree to a large extent on what constitutes good budget documentation. So we're pretty close to a norm or set of norms on that front. What we don't have is anything close to agreement on engagement in the budget process. And by that we mean, how do citizens take part in the budget process? How do they add value in the budget process? But also, what role might legislatures and Supreme Audit institutions play in that process? We can talk, I'll talk more about this perhaps in questions, but we think there are a number of pathways also through which such a norm could come about. And our initial discussions, particularly in disseminating the OBI this year, have found quite a lot of traction in donor institutions to talk about these issues. The final recommendation is to focus on donors and to argue that donors could be doing much more to stimulate and encourage greater budget transparency and engagement in developing countries. Often, the message that one gets from donors on budget transparency is ambiguous, and I think countries feel that ambiguity, and that gives them space not to open up. Donors could play a greater role on budget transparency through a number of ways. Firstly, by increasing the transparency of aid flows, as I'm sure we'd all agree, but particularly to do so in a way that's compatible with budget systems. The point about greater aid transparency should be about the recipient countries, not the donor countries. Donors could emphasize transparency and engagement across all public finance management reforms. This is certainly happening to a greater degree than it has in the past. But again, the extent to which it's happening is focusing on budget documentation, not at all on engagement in the process. Greater budget documentation without opportunities to engage in the process is self-defeating. The two have to go together. Thirdly, we'd like to contribute to a discussion about the linkages, perhaps stronger linkages that are possible between budget transparency performance at country level and the quality of aid. We think there's a lot more scope as donors are discussing shifts to on-budget support or budget support to provide a positive incentive to countries that perform better on transparency. Perform better on budget transparency, get greater budget support. Then the issue of oversight systems. At the moment, and as it has been the case for many, many years, donors provide the vast majority of their support to the executive branch of government. This is important, and we wouldn't want to take away from that. But if you're concerned about budget oversight, we have to start providing adequate, sustainable levels of finance to the set of institutions that are responsible for budget oversight, both constitutionally responsible and more informally responsible. And so we would argue for a much greater proportion of support for more support going to support supreme audit institutions, legislatures, civil society organizations, as well as the judiciary and media. One option, which we've heard about recently, is that apparently DFID is making 5% of all of its support on PFM reforms, making 5% of that available to support to civil society institutions and other oversight institutions. This is a good way to go. Working with civil society institutions has gained increasing currency over the last few years. There are a number of organizations on the ground that weren't there before, but they can't do this alone. Oversight is not solely the responsibility of civil society. And it's time that we started speaking about an oversight system and how that can play a fundamental role, as envisaged by the Constitution, in holding government to their promises. Finally, we'd just like to invite you to go online, look at the OBI, and look at the detailed data, really, that exists for each country. We think that that provides a very clear, coherent set of steps that a country might follow if it were committed, if it does have the political will to improve budget transparency. Okay. Here we go.
Warren and Vivek, thank you very much indeed. And I think it's a very interesting reflection on with your conversation about having a global norm and how we move to that. But I think it's just, as someone who's quite new to International Budget Partnership, I think we only met sort of 6 months ago, I've been extraordinarily impressed by how far you've managed to move this just through a civil society advocacy. And I think the tables you're showing here in terms of the improvements you're seeing in countries and the way you're getting countries to focus on this and what you're just managing just simply by empowering people to see what's going on in their own countries and what's going on in their neighbours, I think is a very powerful demonstration of what you've managed to achieve so far. So it's been very good and very good to know more about what's going on, to hear about these recommendations.